Good morning, everybody. I hope you don't mind me wearing my jacket. It's a bit cold. If I don't wear it, I'm going to be standing up here freezing. So I hope that's okay with you. So I was quite pleased when I was busy preparing for my sermon earlier this week to notice that one of the readings is from the book of 1 Peter. Sorry, I'm just going to move this a little bit. Whoa. Otherwise, I'm going to be talking loudly to you and softly to you. Can you just... Just adjust it quickly for me, please. Thank you. Is that all right? Sorry about that. So as I said, I was quite pleased to notice that one of the readings for today was from the book of 1 Peter, which, as some of you know, is the main book of the Bible that I am studying for my master's thesis, which, you'll be glad to know, is almost finished. I am very excited. It's been a long journey, and I'm just about done. We hope to be finished, done and dusted in about August, September. But the book of 1 Peter is an intriguing letter in academic circles because for a long time it has received only secondary notice and attention in commentaries and studies. And the comparative neglect compared to other books of the New Testament has been so odd and profound that one scholar wrote, 1 Peter is one of the more neglected but fascinating stepchildren of the New Testament canon. And so in response to this scholar went and released a groundbreaking study into 1 Peter that has influenced and inspired subsequent fruitful studies into the book, and hopefully mine will be one of those. The title of my sermon today has changed just slightly thanks to some conversations I had with Bishop Brian earlier in the week. So in the Pew leaflet it says something like making sense of the post-resurrection life. I've adapted that and changed it a little bit. It now reads, resurrection life, absorbing evil and perpetuating good. And what I hope to communicate this morning and through that title is a very simple idea. And the idea is this: we as Christians have been called to live the resurrection life. And in doing so, we have been empowered to absorb the evil around us and neutralize it. And in its place, we have been called to nurture the flourishing of goodness. So in this resurrection life, we absorb evil in the world around us, we neutralize it, and in its place, we nurture the flourishing of goodness. Now, in order to communicate this idea this morning, what I'm going to do is spend the rest of the message focusing deeply on the social historical world of the letter 1 Peter. So for a good part of the sermon, you're going to have a bit of like an academic lecture, and then what I'm going to ask you to do a little bit later is move your minds from academia to the Sunday school classroom, if that's okay. Can you make that jump? Hey, will that be all right? Okay, good. All right. So we're going to focus quite deeply on the social world of the letter of 1 Peter and see what lessons we can draw from it. So at times you might wonder where I'm going with this, but I'm going to ask you to bear with me because we'll get to the point at the end. Now, as I said, the book has been neglected for a large part of early academia, but in recent years there have been a lot of studies, many critical studies done in the book, looking at how the author of 1 Peter, known as Peter, has sought to create, to construct, and preserve a distinct Christian identity in his readers. And there's a good reason why he's doing this, because his readers, these Anatolian Christians, and Anatolia would be parts of Asia Minor in present-day Turkey, these Christians are facing severe, prolonged persecution for their faith. Now, they're not facing persecution or suffering for any kinds of crimes that you and I would understand as crimes, but as I've said, for their faith, for their dogged and unwavering commitment to Jesus Christ. And one of the ways that social groups, let's say like the early Christians, might defend against external threats, let's say like the Roman imperial law and the persecution they were experiencing as a result of it, is to engage in a process of creatively reinterpreting the terms of the social engagement. And this reinterpretation, at least on the part of Peter and his readers, takes place by constructing and preserving a distinct Christian social identity. Not just for the sake of having an identity, but so that they might be enabled to navigate this very difficult situation they are experiencing. Scholars believe that this is a large part of what is happening in the book of 1 Peter, the strategy that Peter is using. Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to give you a simple example that we're going to work through right throughout the message. I want you to notice in chapter 3, verse 13 in our reading today, Peter asks a question. He says this: "Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good?" Now, that's a bit of a strange question, because why would anyone be harmed if they are doing good? Why would anyone suffer if they are eager to do good? Moreover, more specifically, why would anyone be punished under the law if all of their intentions are toward goodness? Because you're only punished by the law if you are what? Unlawful. But this interaction between the Christians and the Romans is quite a strange interaction, such that scholars have taken to, wondering about the conflict between the two groups. And one scholar has written this, that not only were Romans known for their religious tolerance in general, but there is also considerable overlap between the ethics of both groups. In other words, the ethics held by Christians and Romans had a fair bit in common. Not everything, but some things. But yet, even then, there was this strange conflict. Despite this, Christianity and the Roman social world that the Christians inhabited were at odds with one another. Now, it's not entirely relevant for my sermon this morning to go into the specifics of this persecution and the suffering and what sparked it. Rather, it will suffice to say that the Christians were simply convinced they were doing good, but on the other hand, the Romans were irked by them, by their behavior, and they responded accordingly. One of the ways that the Romans responded to the Christians is by assigning to them a label, a name, Christianos. Now, this is a Greek term that originates from the Latin Christianus, and it was used generally to denote the followers, supporters, adherents, and partisans of a person. In this case, Christianos refers to followers, supporters, adherents, and partisans of Jesus Christ. There we go. However, and I've said this before from the front, this label, Christianos, was not assigned as a neutral label or even as a name of honor or in a positive context. Rather, it was intended as a name of shame. Why? Well, if you remember that for many people, and the Romans included, Jesus Christ died a death of ignominy. He died a criminal's death. He died a shameful death. Therefore, to assign Christianos to his followers was intended to shame. It was not a name of honor, but of derision. It was a type of social stigmatization, such that those who bore this mark, Christianos, this stigma, were branded as deviant, flawed, limited, spoiled, or generally undesirable. And the label functioned similarly to how stigma functions in our world today when it comes to views, let's say, around weight or disease or disability and so on. And the problem with stigmas is how they function in a social engagement. Those upon whom the stigma rests are viewed with suspicion. They are seen as inferior and even sometimes seen as dangerous. And consequently, they are treated poorly, and in many cases, in the worst cases, inhumanely. Now, a superficial example of this can be seen when we look at how kids treat one another in school. Now, all of us have been kids here before, and I'm sure all of us can recall at least one time when we were the subject of schoolyard jokes. Anybody brave enough to admit they were a subject of schoolyard joke? I mean, I was. I'm going to tell you. There we go, Michael. Okay, everyone here is amazing. Wow. You guys never got bullied. Wow. Okay. What a life. Okay, so when I was a kid, though, I had the trifecta, right? I was skinny. I had pimples, big ones, you know, the ones that make scars, and I wore braces. And then to add on to that, I donned glasses and I had a fair amount of freckles. So I endured many names like Skinny Malinks, Brace Face, or Four Eyes, to name just a few. And maybe to you those don't seem so bad, but if ever I was in any kind of conflict with another child, it was enough for them to simply invoke one or any or all of those names. And then you know what happens from there. You know how kids are? They feed off one another. So all the kids who are standing around watching, they hear the name tossed around, all of the names, and suddenly it's a shocked face, but with, you know, it's bordering on delight. And then they try to cover their shock with their hand, but it's a kind of a half-hearted attempt to suppress the shock. And then as they feed off one another, the shock turns into giggles, and then giggles, when it becomes too much to bear, just ends in bursting out laughter. And as the kids feed off one another and all of them standing around laughing, you can imagine how difficult it is for a little boy in that moment to maintain his composure when all the kids are sniggering and howling with laughter at his expense. And so in that situation, the effect of the stigma of the labels, the mark, in that moment was quite literally devastating. So on a larger and much more serious scale, this, I think, was the kind of thing that was intended by assigning the label Christianos to the followers of Jesus, to this social group. Not only did it function to belittle and demean, but it also served to justify and legitimize the official and unofficial persecution and maltreatment of these people. But, thankfully, the early Christians did not just accept the name as one of shame. Rather, they sought to creatively reinterpret the terms of the social engagement. How did they do this? Well, we come back to Peter's question. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? Peter then responds almost to his own question. He writes, "But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats, do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against you and against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. On Monday, Bishop Brian and I had a really fascinating conversation about these readings and various topics that arise out of the readings. And I can't discuss all of them here this morning because we don't have enough time for that. But one of the main topics that we discussed was what I mentioned in the beginning, this idea of absorbing evil and neutralizing its power. You see, we as Christians in the resurrection life are called, as I said earlier on, to absorb evil when it is done to us and then neutralize it rather than feeding it and giving it more power. And I think this is what Peter is getting at in the words that I just read from him. Rather than retaliating, Peter encourages his readers to consider the shame that is cast on them not as shame, but as the will of God. If they can conceive of their hardship as part of a larger plan, they will enable themselves to respond differently to the situation than what might have been expected by the Romans. And in this way, they learn to absorb the suffering they are receiving and the evil done to them, and they neutralize it. They strip it of its power rather than feeding it. And with them, in that moment, the evil ends then and there. Now, it's important to make a fine but key distinction here. When I say that it is God's will that they suffer, I'm not offering the image of a sadistic, megalomaniacal God who enjoys subjecting his people to pain. However, I do think that we live in a difficult world that has as much capacity for evil as it does for good. And the thing is, people don't require a lot to survive good. When things are good, they're good, and everybody's good. But when things are difficult, people need copious amounts of resilience if they're going to survive the evil in the world, but without perpetuating it, without feeding it. But alas, this ability does not come easy. And from the witness of Scripture, it is gained through the experience of suffering. It is gained through difficulty, this ability to absorb evil and neutralize it. Right. What I'm going to ask you to do is to move away from the lecture room for a second. Can you all come to the Sunday school class? You happy to do that? All right, here we go. I'm going to talk loud because I don't have a microphone. Now, it's one thing to say that we absorb evil, we neutralize it, and we don't perpetuate it. Maybe that's a bit more difficult to understand in theory, so what I want to do is maybe give you a small example of how it might look in practice. Thank you. This is for the live stream, so unfortunately you still won't hear me talking louder. All right, I want you to get your imagination working and imagine that this glass of water is the world that you and I live in. You got it? All right. Now I want you to imagine that this baking soda that I'm about to put in it is the people of God. It's you and I. All right? We live in this world. And this bleach that I've got here, I want you to imagine as the power of God given to you and I by the Spirit of God. Copiously, abundantly. Okay. We live in this world by the power of God, by His Spirit. But there's some evil in the world, some yellow food coloring. Let's put a name to this evil. We're going to add it into the world. Let's call it that coworker who thinks they own the place. They think they are the CEO. It's not their company, but they think it is. All right? They are slow with encouragement and help, but they're very quick with demands and criticism. We are called to absorb the evil in the world and neutralize its power. But that's not so bad. Maybe let's make something a bit worse. How about that person who has betrayed you or who continues to betray you? You've lost so much in your life because of them, and really the only consistent thing about them is how they hurt you. That's a lot of evil. But we as Christians are called to absorb the evil and neutralize it. Strip it of its power. But then there's some really tough stuff in the world. There's the stuff that takes really long to get over, takes a lot of willpower to get over. Maybe that person that you lost to some senseless crime, some selfish crime, or that person you lost to disease, or something else. It takes a long time and a lot of work to get over, because in a way, it permeates everything. But the thing is, even if it takes a bit longer, even if it's a little bit more work, you and I are called to absorb evil, de-weaponizing the evil. Even if it requires a little bit more effort. We are not called to feed the cycle of evil and giving it power, rather to absorb it and de-weaponize it. Now, that doesn't mean we're not changed by what happens to us. Sometimes we are still affected, but we don't need to perpetuate the cycle. You see, absorbing evil is not just a good idea. It's a necessary idea if you and I want to live in the world we dream of living in. Moreover, it's necessary if we want to create the world that we want our children and future generations to live in. And this idea of absorbing evil doesn't arise in a vacuum, at least not for Peter, because he grounds his challenge to his readers in the ultimate embodiment of what we call in social psychology the group prototype, the person who embodied that prototype perfectly, Jesus Christ. See, for the Christian, Jesus is the ultimate example of how to absorb evil no matter the cost. And we do not suffer alone because, as Peter wrote, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but what? Made alive in the spirit. In Jesus, God went to the cross, not because it was a good idea, but because God deemed it necessary in order to redeem humanity and bring them back to himself, in order that they might be offered the abundant life, or the resurrection life. In dying, Christ absorbed the sin of the world, and in rising again, he was vindicated as Lord. And now this is the same Lord that both constrains and compels us, constrains our temptation toward evil, but compels us toward the nurturing of goodness. And I want to submit to you today that this is what it means to live the resurrection life, that is both now and not yet. Through the risen Christ, the believer, the Christian, is imbued with the power of God's Spirit, imbued with resurrection power, not so that he or she can be better than other people out there in the world, that we can lord it over others. No, rather, so that we might offer ourselves upon the altar. Absorbing evil and ending it with us, so that good may flourish in its place. The believer is given the power in the midst of all this evil to say, like Jesus and like Stephen, whatever happens, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. But in case anyone objects to what I'm saying and mentions that, well, this sounds like capitulation and maybe even wishful thinking, let me just say that this restraining of evil and this compulsion to goodness is rooted and grounded in the love, the kind of love that you and I so desperately wish to receive. We've all made mistakes. Hands up. Right? We've all made them. Some of us have made worse mistakes than others. We've all been misunderstood. Hands up. Anybody here been misunderstood? All right. Some of us are misunderstood more than others. But my sense of things is this: if you and I want to receive the kind of love, this kind of love in response to our mistakes, if we want people to go the extra mile in trying to understand us, in forgiving us, in giving us another chance, and helping us to be good, then you and I need to find it within ourselves. Surely we can find it within ourselves by the Spirit of Christ to offer that same love to the world around us, to those within our lives. And if ever we need some encouragement in this regard, let me offer the words of Jesus as he speaks to his disciples before he was about to die. He said, "If you love me, keep my commands." And what is his command? To love others as he has loved us. I will not leave you as orphans. Jesus says, I'm not asking you to do this on your own, by yourself, in your own power. I will come to you. Before long, the world will not see me anymore, but you will see me. And then, because I live, you also will live. You see, the Christian lives not just as a breather of oxygen or as someone who occupies space in this physical world. No, but we live by the power of God's Spirit in this resurrection life. Not to perpetuate evil, but to start a cycle of goodness. The Christians in 1 Peter were suffering shame for bearing the name Christianos, Christian. Maybe you and I will never know exactly what that feels like, but all of us know what it feels like to feel shame. We all know what it's like to experience unjustified suffering and hurt, especially at the hands of others. My challenge and encouragement to us this morning is this: may we not feed the cycle of evil. May we absorb it, end it, neutralize it, de-weaponize it, and rather begin a process of nurturing goodness, create a new cycle of goodness that we can feed off one another. Like these early Christians, this is how we live the resurrection life. And this is who we are as believers. This is our identity. This is what we are called to do. And so I want to close with Peter's words in the opening chapter of 1 Peter, just as a way to anchor all of what I've said. He begins with praise. Praise be to God, the Father and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, that it may result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Though you have not seen him, you love him, and even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with inexpressible joy, for you are receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So as we are given the power of God's Spirit, as we, the people of God, are given this power, may we take up the mantle of the resurrection life, choosing rather to absorb evil, neutralize it, and perpetuate good in its place. Amen.